There is a man lying under a desert tree, a day's walk past the last town in the south, and he is praying for the one thing God will not give him. He wants to die. His lips are cracked. His feet are still caked with the mud of 100-mile run. His sandals are somewhere behind him in the sand, and there is nobody with him, because he made sure of that. He left his only companion back in Beersheba and walked into the wilderness alone, which is what exhausted people do. They fire the last friend they have and call it a favor. Now look at this man, because here is the part you need to sit with. Yesterday, this same man stood on a mountain in front of an entire nation and called fire out of heaven. Real fire, falling out of a clear sky, in front of thousands of witnesses, at his word. Yesterday he won the most public showdown in the entire Old Testament. Yesterday the crowd was on its faces, shouting that the Lord is God. Today he is under a tree, asking that same Lord to please let it end. Not after a failure, after the greatest victory of his life. Less than 24 hours separate the fire and the tree. And this whole road is about what happened inside them, because his story is going to answer the question so many tired believers are afraid to ask out loud. When a servant of God runs completely out of strength, what does God actually do with him? I will tell you this much now. When heaven finally responds to the man under this tree, the first thing it does will not be a word. Remember that. But to understand the tree, you have to go back 3 years, to the day this man walked into a king's throne room without an invitation. It is 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night in Columbus, Ohio, and a man is sitting at his kitchen table doing the thing he does not tell his wife about. He opens the banking app. He looks at the number. He closes the banking app. 8 months ago, he walked away from a good job because he was certain in the way you are only certain a few times in your life that God was leading him to something else, and everything confirmed it. Doors opened. People he had not talked to in years called out of nowhere with encouragement. His pastor put a hand on his shoulder and said, "I believe this is the Lord." So he jumped, and for a while there was enough. Now every month the number is a little smaller than the month before. Not gone, smaller, and that is its own particular kind of suffering. Watching something drain slowly while you stand there, believing. Tonight he sits in the blue light of the phone and asks the question he has not brought to church, because it feels like an accusation. If God led me here, why is the water going down? Elijah asked it first, sitting beside a shrinking brook. About 2,800 years ago, the Bible introduces Elijah more abruptly than almost anyone in Scripture. No family tree, no childhood, no calling story. 1 Kings chapter 17 simply opens a throne room door, and there he is, a man from the rough hill country of Gilead, standing in front of King Ahab, the most powerful and most corrupt man in Israel, saying one sentence, "As the Lord, the God of Israel lives, whom I serve, there will be neither dew nor rain in the next few years except at my word." Then he turns around and walks out. That is the whole scene. A nobody from nowhere declares a drought to the king's face and disappears. And you would expect what comes next to be bigger. A movement, a platform, a prophet rising. Instead, the very next words out of God's mouth send Elijah in the opposite direction of everything. "Leave here. Turn eastward, hide in the Kerith ravine, and you will drink from the brook. And I have directed the ravens to feed you there. Feel how strange that assignment is. The man just went public in the most dangerous room in the country. And God's follow-up move is to take him off the stage entirely. From the palace to a ditch. From the spokesman of heaven to a man sitting alone by a creek, waiting on birds, and not just any birds, ravens. Under the law Elijah grew up on, ravens were unclean animals, the kind of creature a devout man was taught to keep away from. God chose a delivery service that Elijah's own religion had trained him to look down on, and he made his prophet's survival depend on it. Morning and evening, bread and meat, from the beaks of scavengers. Whatever pride a man carries about how his provision is supposed to look, Kerith was designed to starve it before it starved him. Because here is what was actually happening in that ravine. And it is the reason this chapter matters to every burned-out believer watching this. Elijah was not just being protected from Ahab. He was being retrained. He was a strong man, a responsible man, the kind of man who stands in throne rooms. And people like that share a hidden weakness. They know how to carry. They do not know how to receive. So God built him a classroom with one lesson in it. Sit down. Open your hands. Let something else feed you. You are not your own supply. Some of the most exhausted people in the church today are the strong ones, the reliable ones, the ones everybody else leans on. If that is you, understand that Kerith was not a punishment. Kerith was preparation. God was teaching his man how to receive. Years before the day his life would depend on it under a tree. But now watch what the brook does. Because there is a detail in this story that most sermons walk right past. And it changes everything about how you read it. The drought that was drying up that brook did not come from Ahab. It did not come from Baal. It came from Elijah's own prayer. The New Testament says it plainly. Elijah prayed earnestly that it would not rain, and it did not rain, which means the man sitting in that ravine was watching his own obedience shrink his own water supply. Every day the drought he had asked for reached a little deeper into the one place keeping him alive. Picture the mornings. He walks down to the water, and there is a rock showing that was covered last week. The current gets thinner. The sound gets quieter. A brook does not die suddenly. It dies by inches, in front of you, while you check it every day, like a man checking a banking app at 11 at night. And the question starts circling. I did everything you said. I am exactly where you told me to be. So why is the waterline lower every morning? Now hold on to the hardest fact in this whole chapter. Through all those shrinking mornings, God says nothing. Read the text. There is no daily reassurance at Kerith. No angel explaining the plan. No voice saying 3 more weeks. Song. The last word Elijah got was go to the brook. And then heaven goes quiet. And the brook goes down. And the silence and the shrinking happen at the same time. Day after day. Scripture gives it to us in one devastating line. Some time later, the brook dried up. And then, only then, the very next verse. Then the word of the Lord came to him. Then, after it was completely gone, not when the water got low, not at the halfway point, when a reasonable God would have surely said something, God let the brook finish dying before he gave Elijah the next address. which tells you something about how he works that nobody puts on a coffee mug. Sometimes the next word is scheduled for the far side of the thing you are terrified of losing, because somewhere along the way, most of us picked up a quiet rule of faith that goes like this: if God truly led me here, the supply will not run out. If the door was really his, it stays open. And when the water starts dropping anyway, we conclude one of two things. Either we heard him wrong, or he walked off. Kerith stands in the Bible as a permanent argument against both. The same God who said go to the brook had already scheduled the day that Brook would die. And he led his man there anyway, because the brook was never the point. The brook was a classroom, and classrooms have last days. The God who led Elijah to the brook did not prevent the brook from drying up. Write that down somewhere. The drying was not the plan failing. The drying was the plan turning a page. So here is this chapter's question, and be honest with it. Because the man in Ohio is not the only one checking a number at night. Where is your brook right now? The job, the savings, the relationship, the church, the season that used to hold water. And what did the waterline look like this morning? When Elijah's brook finally died, God spoke, and the new address made no sense at all. He sent his hungry prophet 100 miles north, into enemy country, into the home territory of the very queen who would one day drive him under that tree. And the person God chose to keep his prophet alive, there was not a soldier, not a rich man, not a believer with a full pantry. It was a widow gathering 2 sticks, getting ready to cook the last meal of her life. It is a Thursday morning in Pittsburgh, and a 61-year-old man has been sitting in his car in a church parking lot for 20 minutes. Engine off, hands on the wheel. Inside that building is a food pantry. He knows exactly how it works, because for almost 30 years, he was the man on the other side of the table. He organized the canned food drives. He drove the truck. He carried boxes up apartment stairs for strangers and told his kids on the ride home, "This is what we do. We are the helping kind." Then came the layoff at 59, and the savings that went to his daughter's medical bills, and the mortgage that did not care about any of it. There is food in that building with his name on it, and he cannot get out of the car, because it is not hunger keeping him in that seat. He could handle hunger. It is the walk, those 40 feet of asphalt between the man who helps and the man who needs. And he would rather sit here and starve slowly than cross them, because on the far side of that walk, he stops being the person he has been proud of his whole life. God once ran a hungry prophet straight into that exact wall when the brook at Kerith finally died. The word of the Lord came to Elijah with a new address, and the address was a scandal. Go at once to Zarephath in the region of Sidon and stay there. I have directed a widow there to supply you with food. Sidon, let that land on you the way it would have landed on Elijah. Sidon was not neutral ground. Sidon was the home country of Jezebel, the queen who was hunting the prophets of the Lord, the daughter of the very king who ruled that coastline. Zarephath sat in the heart of Baal's territory, the god of rain and storms, the idol. This whole drought was designed to humiliate. God took his most wanted man and hid him behind enemy lines, in the backyard of the family that wanted him dead. Nobody hunts for you in your enemy's hometown. It is the last place on earth anyone would look, which is exactly why God picked it. But the location is only half the scandal. Look at the supply line. I have directed a widow there to supply you. A widow. In the ancient world, a widow was not a person with a safety net. A widow in a famine was the poorest of the poor, the first to go hungry and the first to die. A woman with no husband, no income, and no protection. If you were making a list of people in Zarephath capable of feeding an extra mouth for months, she would be the last name on the last page. And God skipped every merchant, every landowner, every full pantry in that city, and assigned his prophet to her. So Elijah walks 100 miles north through a dying country, and at the town gate he sees her, a woman gathering sticks. And the text gives us a detail so small and so heavy that you cannot make it up. She is gathering 2 sticks, not an armload. 2. She is not building a woodpile for the winter, because she does not believe she has a winter. She is counting fuel for exactly 1 fire. Elijah asks her for a drink of water, and as she turns to get it, he adds the impossible part. And please, a piece of bread. And the sentence that comes out of her is one of the bleakest in the Old Testament. As surely as the Lord your God lives, she says, I do not have any bread. Only a handful of flour in a jar and a little olive oil in a jug. I am gathering a few sticks to take home and make a meal for myself and my son, that we may eat it, and that we may eat it, and die. She has done the math. There is 1 meal left in her house, and she has already decided how the story ends. This is the supply line God chose. A hungry prophet sent to a starving widow in the capital region of the enemy. 2 empty people assigned to each other. And now watch what Elijah has to do, because this is the hinge of the whole chapter. The strong man from the throne room, the prophet who shut the sky, has to stand at a town gate and ask a dying woman to feed him first. Make me a small loaf of bread first, he says, from what you have, and then make something for yourself and your son. For this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. The jar of flour will not be used up, and the jug of oil will not run dry until the day the Lord sends rain. She could have said no. She was a Sidonian. This was not her God, and the man was asking for her child's last food. Instead, she went home and did it, and the jar of flour was not used up, and the jug of oil did not run dry. Day after day, month after month, exactly as the word had said, the miracle did not flow around these 2 people. It flowed between them. His faith needed her bread. Her bread needed his word. Neither one of them could have survived that famine alone. And God wired it that way on purpose. But be careful with this jar, because it is easy to preach it wrong. The flour never became abundance. The jar never filled to the top. Every single morning that woman reached into that jar and found the same thing. Enough for today. And tomorrow she would have to reach in again, not knowing, and find it again. This is not a story about God making anybody rich. This is daily bread in the middle of a famine. Provision with no stockpile attached. The kind of miracle that keeps you dependent the whole time. It keeps you alive. Here is what Zarephath was doing to Elijah, and what it might be trying to do to you. There is a lie that runs deep in strong people, and it runs especially deep in this country, where we practically baptize it. The lie says that serving God means never needing anyone. Be the giver. Be the rock. Be the one they call, and needing help Real help, the kind you cannot pay back, feels like the failure of everything you are. But look at the pattern God is building in this man's life. At Kerith, birds fed him. At Zarephath, a foreign widow fed him. Later, under a tree, someone else is going to feed him. The greatest prophet of his generation almost never feeds himself in this story. God keeps him alive for years through a chain of unlikely hands, as if to burn one truth into him before the hardest night of his life arrives. Receiving is not the opposite of serving me. Sometimes receiving is the assignment. The man in the Pittsburgh parking lot finally opened the car door. By the way, he said later, the walk across the lot took everything Carmel would take, and a volunteer he had never met handed him a box, and he stood there holding it, and something in him that had been clenched for 30 years let go. So here is this chapter's question. Who is your widow? The help that has been standing at your town gate for months while you sat in the car, because taking it would cost you the version of yourself you are proudest of. Keep your eye on who keeps feeding this man. It is going to matter. Under a tree, in the dark, because in that little house in Zarephath, the flour held and the oil held, morning after morning, until the day the miracle house learned what every house eventually learns. The boy got sick, and then the boy stopped breathing. It is 4 in the morning in Phoenix, Arizona, and an ICU nurse is sitting in the break room with a cup of coffee that went cold an hour ago. 4th night shift in a row. Around 9 in the evening, she stood at the bedside of the man in room 12, a grandfather with numbers so bad the whole floor had quietly stopped hoping. And she did what she always does on the hard ones. She prayed under her breath while she worked. And the man in room 12 turned around in a way that made the attending physician stand at the monitor saying, "I have no explanation for this." By midnight, the family was crying happy tears in the hallway, and the nurse drove a silent little prayer of thanks up through the ceiling tiles. At 2 in the morning, the woman in room 14 coded, 38 years old, 3 kids whose crayon drawings were taped to the wall by her bed. The nurse had prayed over her too. Same whisper, same faith, same God. They worked on her for 40 minutes. She did not come back. So now it is 4 in the morning, and the nurse is doing a kind of math they do not teach in nursing school and do not talk about in church. Same night, same hallway, same prayer, room 12 and room 14. And the question sitting across the table from her, drinking its own cold coffee, is the one she will carry to her car at dawn. What is the difference? And why does the God who clearly showed up 40 feet down the hall feel like he skipped this room? The house in Zarephath was room 12 and room 14 under one roof, because look at where the story goes. Sometime later, the text says, the son of the woman who owned the house became ill. He grew worse and worse, and finally stopped breathing. And I need you to feel the full cruelty of the timing. This was the miracle house. This was the one home in Phoenicia where God was visibly, provably at work, where every single morning the flour was there again, and the oil was there again. Grace you could touch with your hands. The boy who died had been eating miracle bread for months. The jar was probably still holding that morning. The wonder was working downstairs while the child went cold upstairs. And no verse in between offers one word of why. Yesterday's miracle bought them yesterday. It did not buy them this. And the mother explodes at Elijah. And what she says is one of the oldest reflexes in the human heart. What do you have against me? Man of God, did you come to remind me of my sin and kill my son? Hear what grief just did in that sentence. It went looking for a verdict. Something this terrible cannot just happen. So somebody must have signed off on it. And if somebody signed off on it, there must be a charge on file. And she is sure she knows what the charge is. My sin, some old, buried thing, dug up by the presence of a holy man, paid for in her son's body, thousands of years before anyone taught a course on grief. This widow is standing in her doorway, teaching us what pain does the moment it hits. It reaches for guilt, because guilt at least gives it a reason. And a reason feels less terrifying than a world where boys in miracle houses just die. Now, watch Elijah, because what he does next is the whole chapter. And the first thing to notice is what he does not do. He does not correct her theology. The man is a prophet. He has a professional opinion about whether her sin killed her son. He offers none of it. Standing in front of a screaming, grieving mother, the man of God says exactly 3 words. Give me your son. Then he takes the boy from her arms. Feel the physical weight of that. He carries the body up the stairs to the little room on the roof where he had been staying. And he lays the boy on his own bed. And then Elijah shuts the door, turns his face toward heaven, and falls apart. Lord my God, he cries out, have you brought tragedy, even on this widow I am staying with, by causing her son to die? Stop and stand in front of that prayer. That is not a calm intercession. That is an accusation with a question mark on the end of it. Elijah is asking God, to his face, whether God himself just did this terrible thing. In this house, of all houses, to this woman of all women, the prophet does not understand what is happening any better than the widow downstairs does. The difference between them is only in the address. Her confusion went at the man of God. His confusion went straight at God. Both of them are bewildered. One of them is bewildered in prayer. And if you have walked this channel's roads with us before, you know this family. This is the family of Job, hurling honest questions at the sky and refusing to let go of the one he was questioning. Elijah stands in that same line. The Bible keeps making room for believers who bring God their bewilderment raw, and it keeps declining to punish them for it. Then Elijah does something no one had ever done in the whole recorded history of the world up to that moment. He stretches himself out on the boy's body, arms to arms, face to face, and he cries out to the Lord. And he does it 3 times. There was no precedent for this. No scripture promised it would work. Nobody in the Bible had ever been raised from the dead before this room. Elijah is out past the edge of the map, praying with his whole body for something that has never once happened. And he does it 3 times, which means twice he lifted himself up, looked at a boy who was still dead, and went back down anyway. And the Lord heard Elijah's cry. The text says, and the boy's life returned to him, and he lived. Elijah carries him down the stairs and hands him to his mother and says, look, your son is alive. And this Sidonian woman, this outsider from Baal country, says the sentence the whole chapter was waiting for. Now I know that you are a man of God, and that the word of the Lord from your mouth is the truth. Now I need to be honest with you here, because this book deserves honest handling, and so does the nurse in Phoenix. This resurrection is not a formula. It is one of the rarest events in the entire Bible, and it is not a promise that every prayed-over child comes back. That nurse prayed the same prayer twice in one night and got 2 different answers. And Scripture never explains that arithmetic. Not in 1 Kings, and not anywhere. If you have a room 14 in your story, this chapter is not here to tell you that you prayed wrong or believed short. It is here to show you something smaller and bigger at the same time. The man God is going to meet under the broom tree is a man who had already stood in a room where nothing made sense. He had already held the worst thing in his arms. He had already yelled his why at the ceiling, and he stayed in the room. Faith that has no explanation is still faith. Sometimes it is the purest kind there is. So here is this chapter's question, and bring it out gently, because it has been buried a long time for some of you. What is your room 14? The prayer that did not get what the other prayer got. The one you have never said out loud in church. Because church is where you learn to talk about room 12. Elijah took his straight up the stairs and said it to God's face. And God's answer, whatever else it was not anger. Elijah had now seen God provide food out of thin air and hand a dead boy back to his mother. Giat Midaklas, in a hidden house, behind enemy lines. But the next confrontation would not happen inside a quiet house. It would happen on a mountaintop, in front of the entire nation, against 850 enemies, with the whole ancient world watching to see whose God answered. It is 11:40 at night in a small town in Alabama, and a high school football coach is sitting alone in his truck in an empty stadium parking lot. Tonight, after 19 seasons, he finally won the state championship. 2 hours ago there was Gatorade in his hair and a towel on his shoulders and a trophy over his head. Now the field lights are off. Everyone has driven home, and the man who just got everything he ever worked for is sitting in the dark with his hands on the wheel, not turning the key, because something is wrong, and he cannot tell anybody what it is, because there is no polite way to say it. He feels empty. He just won everything. So why does the truck feel like a waiting room? Hold that empty parking lot. Keep it running in the back of your mind, because we are about to watch the greatest public victory in the Old Testament. And I need you to watch it already, knowing what is waiting on the other side of it. In the 3rd year of the drought, the word of the Lord came to Elijah. Go and present yourself to Ahab, and I will send rain on the land. So the hidden man comes out of hiding. And on the road to that meeting, the text gives us a glimpse of just how dark Israel had gotten. Because Elijah runs into a palace official named Obadiah, a man who feared God and served in Ahab's own administration. And we learn that Obadiah had been hiding 100 prophets of the Lord in caves, 50 to a cave, smuggling them bread and water, because Jezebel was killing them. Sit with that for a second. The faithful were living underground, in holes, in their own country. That is the nation Elijah is about to call up a mountain. Ahab sees Elijah coming and greets him with a title. Is that you? You troubler of Israel. 3 years of drought. And the king has decided the problem is the weatherman. Elijah hands it right back. I have not made trouble for Israel, but you and your father's family have, because you have abandoned the Lord's commands and followed the Baals. Then he issues the challenge. Summon the people from all over Israel to meet me on Mount Carmel, and bring the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah who eat at Jezebel's table. And Ahab does it. That is its own small miracle. But a showdown was in everyone's interest by now. The whole nation climbs Carmel, a green mountain gone brown, overlooking the sea. On one side, 850 prophets in their vestments, backed by the crown. On the other side, one man, Elijah, steps in front of the crowd and asks the question the entire drought had been asking. How long will you keep limping between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal is God, follow him. Now that word limping is not decoration. And I want to hand it to you the way the Hebrew hands it over. The word is pazach. It means to hobble, to stagger, to hop unevenly from one leg to the other. Israel had not rejected God. That is the sting of it. They were limping between two altars. A little Yahweh for the harvest festivals, a little Baal for the rain, one leg on each, committed to neither. And you cannot walk anywhere like that. And here is the detail that tells you the writer chose that word with a straight face and a sharpened knife. A few verses later, when the prophets of Baal start their ritual around their altar, the text uses the same root word to describe their dance. They limped around the altar they had made. The nation was limping between opinions, and their prophets were limping around a dead God. One word, two pictures, and the writer wants you to see that they are the same picture. The people answered Elijah with nothing. Silence from the whole mountain. So Elijah lays out the terms. 2 bulls, 2 altars, wood, but no fire. You call on the name of your God, and I will call on the name of the Lord, the God who answers by fire. He is God. And all the people finally speak, and they say, "What you say is good." Everyone loved the test. The test meant somebody else had to decide. The prophets of Baal go first, and they get the whole morning. And what follows is 6 hours of the loudest nothing in Scripture. They call on Baal from morning till noon. "Baal, answer us." They shout. They dance their limping dance around the altar. And the text drops its verdict in a line built out of 3 flat denials. But there was no response. No one answered. No one paid attention. At noon, Elijah begins to taunt them. And the taunting in the original is rougher than your church translation let on. "Shout louder," he says. Surely he is a god. Perhaps he is deep in thought, or busy, or traveling. Maybe he is sleeping and must be awakened. So they shouted louder and slashed themselves with swords and spears, as their custom was, until their blood flowed. Because that is what worship becomes when the god is deaf, a performance that keeps raising its own price. Midday passed, evening approached, and the same 3-part silence comes down like a gavel. But there was no response. No one answered. No one paid attention. Then Elijah said to all the people, "Come here to me." And the crowd gathers around. And the first thing he does is quiet. And it might be the most important thing he does all day. He repairs the altar of the Lord, which was in ruins. There had been an altar to Yahweh on that mountain once, and it had been torn down and left in pieces. And Elijah gets down and rebuilds it with his hands, and he uses 12 stones, one for each of the tribes of the sons of Jacob. 12. The nation had been split in two for generations. 10 tribes north, 2 tribes south. A civil wound everyone had learned to live with. And this man stacks 12 stones anyway, building the altar in the shape of a family that no longer existed on any map, because heaven had never updated its arithmetic. Then he does the thing that still stops me every time I read it. He digs a trench around the altar. He has them cut up the bull and lay it on the wood. And he says, "Fill 4 large jars with water and pour it on the offering and on the wood. In the 3rd year of a killing drought, when water was worth more than silver, he pours out the most precious thing in the country." Then he says, "Do it again." And they do it again. Do it a 3rd time, 12 jars in all, until the water runs down the altar and stands in the trench like a moat. Understand what that water was. That was Elijah burning his own escape route. Wet wood cannot be lit by a trick, and a soaked altar cannot be explained away. And if fire does not fall now, there is no version of this where he walks off the mountain alive. He made the test as impossible as he could make it, on purpose, in front of everyone. And then, at the time of the evening sacrifice, Elijah steps forward and prays. And after 6 hours of shouting and slashing and limping, the prophet of the Lord prays for about 30 seconds. Count it sometime. "Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known today that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant, and that I have done all these things at your command. Answer me, Lord, answer me, so these people will know that you, Lord, are God, and that you are turning their hearts back again." Notice there is not one request for himself in it. No safety, no vindication, no career. The whole prayer leans on one hope, that you are turning their hearts back. He is not asking for a show. He is asking for a homecoming. Then the fire of the Lord fell, and it burned up the sacrifice and the wood and the stones and the soil, and licked up the water in the trench. And it did not come up from the wood the way fire is supposed to. It came down out of a sky that had not produced so much as a cloud in 3 years. And it did not stop at the bull. It ate the stones. It ate the dirt. It drank the trench dry to the last drop, as if heaven wanted no piece of evidence left standing except the conclusion. And when all the people saw it, they fell on their faces, the whole mountainside of them going down like a wave, and cried, "The Lord, He is God. The Lord, He is God." What happened next to the prophets of Baal? The text reports in a few hard sentences. Elijah had them seized and brought down to the Kishon Valley, and there they were executed. It was the covenant law of that ancient nation being applied to state-sponsored prophets who had led it into ruin. The language of an ancient legal world. And the text spends no time enjoying it. And neither will we, because the part of this day that concerns our road is not what happened to the prophets of Baal. It is what was quietly happening inside the prophet of the Lord. So run the tape of this day back one more time, and this time keep the camera on Elijah's face instead of the fire. One man stood on that mountain against 850, with a king who hated him in the front row and a crowd that would have gone home shrugging if the sky had stayed shut. One man carried the reputation of God in front of an entire nation for an afternoon, with no colleague, no backup, and no plan B. after 3 years of hiding, on the far end of a famine he had personally announced, the adrenaline it takes to do that does not come from nowhere. The body borrows it at interest, and the body always sends the bill. Count what this day cost him. Nobody on that mountain did. Not even him, because there is a belief that runs this country. And it runs a lot of churches too. And Carmel exists partly to break it. The belief says that public victory proves private wholeness. If the ministry is growing, the minister must be fine. If she pulled off the event, she must be fine. If he just won state, look at him. He is on top of the world. We read the scoreboard as a medical chart. And all the while, the strongest person on the mountain can be standing at the summit of their whole life, one day from begging God to let them die, and not know it themselves. The fire proved everything about God that day. It proved nothing about the condition of the man it fell for. So here is this chapter's question, and it may sting the strong ones. What is your Carmel? The day everybody else remembers as your greatest, the win they still bring up when they introduce you, and when you are honest at 11:40 at night, in the truck, in the empty lot. Is it also the day something in you started to go quiet? The fire had fallen, the nation was on its faces, and Elijah had roughly 18 hours left before he would beg God to let him die. But first, he had to outrun a storm. It is a Tuesday afternoon in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and a woman is crying in aisle 7 of a grocery store, and she could not tell you why to save her life. For 14 months she ran her mother's cancer like a military operation. Chemo calendars on the fridge, insurance appeals written at midnight, emergency room nights, medication charts, the works. And through all of it, she did not cry once. Not in front of her mother, not in front of her kids, because somebody had to keep the wheels on, and she was the somebody. At the funeral 6 weeks ago, person after person squeezed her hand and said the same thing. You are so strong. She held the whole line while the whole line was under fire. And today she came in for milk and bread and turned down aisle 7. And the store has stopped carrying the soup, the chicken and rice one, the one her mother would actually eat on the bad weeks, the one she bought 40 times in 14 months. The shelf has been reset and the soup is gone. And this woman is standing in front of canned goods with tears running down her face, coming apart in public over inventory. And the question she asks herself right there, gripping the cart, is the question this chapter exists to answer. I held it together through the dying. Why am I falling apart over soup? Because the collapse almost never comes during the war. It comes after, when the body decides the war is over. Elijah is about to prove it, on the greatest day of his life. Because look at what happens on Carmel after the fire. And notice the part nobody preaches. Elijah does not get to go lie down. The fire falls. The people shout. The false prophets are dealt with. And Elijah turns to Ahab and says, Go, eat and drink, for there is the sound of a heavy rain. And then, while the king goes off to eat, the prophet climbs back up to the top of Carmel for round 2. The fire was answered in seconds. The rain is going to be different. Elijah bent down to the ground and put his face between his knees. Feel that posture. This is not a man standing tall with his arms raised in triumph. This is a man folded in half in the dirt, spent, pressing his forehead toward his own body, and praying. And he says to his servant, "Go and look toward the sea." The servant climbs to where he can see the water, looks, comes back. There is nothing there. Go back. Elijah says, "Nothing." Go back. Nothing. Go back. Nothing. Go back. Nothing. Go back. 6 times the servant walks out, puts his hand over his eyes, scans a horizon as empty as it has been for 3 years, and comes back with the same report. Nothing. Now stop and ask the obvious question. God had already told Elijah, back at the start of this chapter, "I will send rain on the land." The promise was explicit. The fire had just fallen an hour ago. If ever a man had earned an instant answer, it was this man on this afternoon. And God makes him ask 7 times. Even on the far side of the greatest miracle of the age, prayer did not switch over to automatic. There is no version of faith, not even Elijah's on his best day, that gets to stop asking and stop watching. The 7th time, the servant comes back and says, "A cloud as small as a man's hand is rising from the sea." A man's hand. That is the whole report. After 3 years of drought and 6 hours of fire from heaven, the evidence of the coming storm is a smudge on the horizon you could blot out with your palm, and Elijah moves on it instantly. "Go tell Ahab, hitch up your chariot and get down the mountain before the rain stops you." And while Ahab is scrambling, the sky grows black with clouds, the wind rises, and a heavy rain comes sweeping in off the sea. And the thing Elijah asked for 3 years ago, the thing his own prayer had shut off, comes roaring back over a dead brown land. The water is back. Remember the waterline at Kerith, going down morning after morning. Heaven just paid that account in full, over an entire country at once. And then comes one of the strangest sentences in the Old Testament. "The power of the Lord came on Elijah, and tucking his cloak into his belt, he ran ahead of Ahab all the way to Jezreel." Ahab is in a chariot, behind horses. Jezreel is about 17 miles away, across the valley, in a driving rainstorm, at night. And Elijah, on foot, in his 50s or beyond, for all we know, hikes up his robe and outruns the horses the entire way, 17 miles, through mud, through rain, downhill and across the flats, a lone figure pounding along in the dark ahead of the king's chariot, like the whole day had one more gear in it. It is the single most physically spectacular thing the man ever does. And the text gives it one verse. Now, stand back and add up this day the way you would add up a receipt. 3 years of hiding and strain behind him. A morning staring down 850 hostile prophets and a king who wanted him dead. 6 hours holding the line alone in front of a nation. The most intense 30 seconds of prayer in his life, with everything riding on it. Then, no rest. A second vigil, folded in the dirt, praying 7 rounds for the rain. Then, a 17-mile sprint through a storm that would put a man half his age in the hospital. And notice what the text never mentions anywhere in this chapter. It never says he ate. It never says he slept. The last meal Scripture records is bread from a widow's jar in another country. Now, the text will not hand Elijah a modern diagnosis, and neither will I. Scripture is older and wiser than our vocabulary, and it does not need our labels. But look at the raw ledger. It does record with its own eyes. Prolonged fear, prolonged isolation, crushing responsibility carried alone, a confrontation with unimaginable stakes, a massive physical output at the end of it, no food that we are told of, no sleep that we are told of, and underneath all of it, 3 years of a nervous system that was never once allowed to stand down. Whatever name you want to give what happens in the next chapter, I understand this first. The ledger was already full. The account was already overdrawn. The man running through that rain feels unstoppable. Because the body always feels unstoppable right before it sends the bill. That is the counterfeit. This chapter drags into the light. And the woman in aisle 7 knows it by heart. We believe that when the crisis ends, peace begins. Immediately. Automatically. Like a light switch. The funeral is over. So I should be better now. The project shipped. The divorce is final. The diagnosis came back clear. The championship is won. So why am I getting worse? And when the crash comes after the finish line instead of before it, we read the timing as proof that something is wrong with us. And we prosecute ourselves for weakness at the exact moment the body is doing the most human thing a body does. It held the line as long as the line needed holding. Then it handed you the invoice. The soup was never the reason. The soup was just the day the bill arrived. So here is this chapter's question. And be kind to yourself when you answer it. What was your aisle 7? The small, almost embarrassing thing that finally broke you after you had survived all the enormous things. And the harder half. Have you been holding it against yourself ever since? Calling yourself weak for going down over soup, when the truth is, you went down, carrying 14 months. Elijah comes pounding into Jezreel, ahead of the king's horses. Soaked, emptied, and as far as he knows, victorious. The fire has fallen. The rain has returned. The nation has shouted the right name at the sky for the first time in a generation. Surely, surely, the queen who ate at Baal's table will read the scoreboard and stand down. Elijah had survived the drought, confronted the king, stood alone on Carmel, prayed down the rain, and outrun a royal chariot. But he was not prepared for the message waiting for him in Jezreel. It is 11:30 on a Saturday night in Nashville, Tennessee, and a woman is sitting on her kitchen floor with her back against the refrigerator, and she cannot get up. Tonight was her night. The fundraising banquet she spent 9 months building, the one for the new children's wing, blew past its goal by $40,000. There was a standing ovation. The pastor called her up front and said her name into the microphone, and the whole room rose. And people she barely knew hugged her in the lobby and said, "We could never have done this without you," which is exactly the sentence she has organized her entire life around hearing. Now the house is dark. Her husband and kids are asleep. She came downstairs for a glass of water, and somewhere between the sink and the stairs, her legs simply declined, and she slid down the front of the refrigerator. And here she sits on the tile at 11:30 at night, still in her banquet clothes. She is not crying. That is what scares her. She is just sitting, hollowed out, and a thought arrives. Calm as a house guest. I do not want to die. I just do not know how to keep being the person everyone needs me to be. And right behind it comes the second thought, the one with teeth. If I ever said that out loud, everyone would decide my faith was fake the whole time, including God. She is sitting under Elijah's tree. It grows in every century. Because here is what was waiting for Elijah in Jezreel. Ahab got home first, barely, and told Jezebel everything Elijah had done. The fire, the crowd, the prophets of Baal put to the sword, and Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah with a single sentence: "May the gods deal with me, be it ever so severely, if by this time tomorrow I do not make your life like the life of one of them." Now slow down and look at what that actually is, because the smallness of it is the whole point. Jezebel is the most ruthless political operator in the country. If she wanted Elijah dead, her men could have taken him that night. He was standing at her city gate, soaked, exhausted, alone. Instead, she sends a message, a threat with a 24-hour timer on it, designed to do exactly what it did. She could not beat his God on the mountain, so she went after the man in the valley. And she did it with words, because she understood something about the human machine that the church forgets. You do not need an army to break an empty man. When the tank is dry, a message will do it. And Elijah was afraid. The text says, "and ran for his life." The man who did not blink at 850 prophets, the man who stood in a throne room and shut the sky, reads a few sentences from a courier and comes apart. He runs south, out of Israel entirely, 90-some miles to Beersheba, the last town before the wilderness, running from a woman who sent a note. If that has ever confused you about Elijah, if you have ever heard a preacher scold him at this point in the story, hold on, because heaven is about to weigh in on how it sees this man, and it is not going to match the sermon. At Beersheba, Elijah does one more thing, and it is a small detail with a long shadow. He left his servant there. The text says, "and went a day's journey into the wilderness alone." His one companion, the last human being attached to his life. And he unhooks him at the town gate and walks into the desert by himself. Watch that move, because exhaustion pulls it on everyone. When you are full, you gather people. When you are running on fumes, something in you starts firing them. You stop returning calls. You skip the group. You tell the ones who love you that you are fine. And you mean leave. Because being seen takes energy you do not have. And being alone feels like the only room left with air in it. Exhaustion lies to you about what you need. It points away from every hand that could help you carry it, and calls that direction relief. Elijah left his servant behind. File that away, because God is going to answer that exact move before this story ends. A day deeper into the wilderness, Elijah finds a broom tree, a desert shrub with just enough shade for one man, and he sits down under it, and he prays the darkest prayer of his life. "I have had enough. Lord, take my life. I am no better than my ancestors." Then he lies down under the tree and falls asleep, which is its own kind of prayer. The body voting when the mouth is done. I have had enough. If you have ever prayed a sentence anywhere in that family, and some of you have prayed it this week, I need you to watch very closely what heaven does next, because whatever you were braced for, whatever tone you have been taught to expect from God when a believer hits the floor, this is not going to be it. Think of everything a disappointed heaven could have said to this man. Where is your faith? Eliach, you watched fire fall out of the sky yesterday. After everything I have done for you, this is your response. Running from one woman. Think of the sermon available to God in that moment. Every point of it accurate. And now read what the text actually records. He fell asleep, and all at once an angel touched him. Touched him. There is the first response of heaven to a servant of God who wants to die. And it is not a word. I told you at the start of this road to remember that. Before any voice, before any question, before one syllable of correction or comfort, there is a hand on his shoulder, the oldest signal in the world, the one every parent knows in the dark of a child's bad night. You are not alone in this room. That came first. Everything else waited. And then the angel says 5 words. Get up and eat. That is the entire message. No review of the Jezebel situation. No follow-up questions about the resignation letter he just filed. A hunt. And then get up and eat. An instruction sized exactly to the strength of the man receiving it. Elijah looks around, and there by his head, in the middle of a wilderness, is bread baking over hot coals, and a jar of water. Somebody built a fire. Somebody baked, heaven cooked for a suicidal man, and stood by while he ate, and let him lie back down, because he does lie back down. He eats, drinks, and goes right back to sleep. And heaven lets him. No angel shakes him and says, "We are on a schedule." The man sleeps. Off the edge of the page, we do not know how long. And the angel of the Lord comes back a second time, and touches him a second time, and feeds him a second time. And this time, the angel adds 1 sentence. And in a book full of thunder, it might be the gentlest sentence God ever sends anybody. Get up and eat. For the journey is too much for you. The journey is too much for you. Stand in front of that. God says it out loud, to his strongest prophet, without one atom of shame attached. He does not say, the journey only feels like too much. He does not say, it would not be too much if your faith were in better shape. He looks at the actual man on the actual ground and tells him the truth about his condition, the way a good doctor does, and then he hands him bread. Heaven agreed with Elijah's exhaustion. It just refused to agree with his conclusion. So write this down somewhere. You will find it on a bad night. God did not confuse Elijah's exhaustion with rebellion. He never has. Read the whole scene again and search it for one word of rebuke, one raised eyebrow, one disappointed sigh out of heaven. It is not there. God can tell the difference between a servant who stopped loving him and a servant who ran out of strength loving him. He could tell the difference under that tree, and he can tell it on your kitchen floor, even on the nights you cannot tell it yourself. And notice the order of operations, because the order is the sermon. Sleep first, then bread, then more sleep, then more bread. The theology, the questions, the recommissioning, all of that is coming. But it is 40 days away, and God is in no hurry to get to it. Before God addressed anything in Elijah's soul, he spent this entire scene on Elijah's body. Sleep was the first sermon. Bread was the second. The word could wait, and it did. Now let me say one thing plainly here, because this scene deserves honest handling, and so do you. This is a picture of how gently God regards the exhausted. It is not a complete prescription. Bread and sleep met Elijah's collapse, and some collapses need more hands than that. the hands God has already stationed in this world for exactly this work. A friend you trust with the whole truth. A pastor, a doctor, a counselor. Reaching for them is not a failure of faith. It is Zarephath all over again. Provision wearing a human face. And taking it is obedience, not defeat. If the tree you are under is that dark tonight, please do not sit under it alone. Here is this chapter's question, and it has two parts. What was your message from Jezreel? The small thing that broke you after you had survived all the big things. And the harder part, what have you been bracing for God to say about your collapse? Because you have had a speech playing in your head. His imagined disappointment, word for word. Now you have seen what he actually said to the worst collapse in prophetic history. A touch, bread, sleep. The journey is too much for you. Compare the two speeches and ask yourself which one you are going to keep listening to. One more thing before we leave this tree. File away the smell of that bread on those coals. Charcoal, fresh bread, and a broken servant of God, fed before he is asked a single question. About 900 years from now, on a beach, at dawn, you are going to smell that exact combination again. And when you do, you will know whose kitchen it came from, strengthened by that food. The text says, Elijah traveled 40 days and 40 nights until he reached Horeb, the mountain of God, and there, in a cave, God is going to ask him a question. Then he is going to pass by. And what Elijah learns about where God is not is about to undo everything he thought Carmel taught him. It is Monday, 12:15 in the afternoon, in an office park in Seattle, and a 55-year-old engineer is eating lunch alone at his desk, same as every Monday, and having the same conversation with God he has been having for years. He is the last one. That is how it feels. Anyway, last believer on his floor. Maybe in the building. The men he prayed with in college have moved on. Honor by un, some loudly, some with a shrug. His own 2 kids, raised in the pew, grown now, have both sat him down in recent years, gentle as surgeons, and explained that they no longer believe any of it. His wife still goes to church with him, but the friends they had there have retired south, and the sanctuary gets grayer every year. So he eats his sandwich over a napkin, and on the drive home, he will say the thing he says every Monday, the prayer that has worn a groove. Lord, I am the only one left, and I am so tired of being the only one left. That sentence is 2,800 years old. God has heard it before, word for word, inside a cave. And what he said back to it is the whole reason this chapter exists. Strengthened by 2 angel-cooked meals, Elijah walks 40 days and 40 nights south, deep into the Sinai wilderness, to Horeb, the mountain of God. And you need to know what that address means, because Elijah certainly did. Horeb is Sinai, the mountain, the one wrapped in fire and smoke in the days of Moses, where the covenant was cut, where the commandments came down, where Moses himself hid in a cleft of the rock while the glory of God passed by. This is the ground zero of Israel's entire faith. And the broken prophet walks 40 days to get there, the same number Moses fasted on that same mountain, and crawls into a cave, quite possibly the same hollow of rock by ancient reckoning, and spends the night. Do you see what the text is doing? It is dressing Elijah in Moses' story, step by step, and it is showing you what worn-out believers have done in every generation since. When the present stops making sense, we go back to where it started, back to the old mountain, back to the place where God was loud once. The exhausted man is making a pilgrimage to the last spot on earth where the foundations felt solid, and the word of the Lord came to him there. And it came as a question, "What are you doing here, Eliah?" Do not read that with an edge in it. This is not a security guard demanding to see a pass. God asks the way a counselor asks, the way the best questions work. As a door, Elijah has been running and walking and sleeping for 40-some days. And as far as the record shows, nobody has asked him a single question since Jezebel's courier found him. God's opening move at Horeb is to hand the man a microphone, and Elijah empties both barrels. "I have been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty. The Israelites have rejected your covenant, torn down your altars, and put your prophets to death with the sword. I am the only one left, and now they are trying to kill me too." Look at that answer, because every clause of it is doing something. I have been very zealous. There is the resume, the receipts, the whole burned-out ledger of everything he has spent. They have rejected, torn down, killed. There is the grief. A man reciting the funeral of his nation's faith, and then the bottom line, the sentence underneath, his whole collapse. I am the only one left. That is not a data point to Elijah. That is the weight. Do the math he is doing. If he is the last faithful man standing, then the entire covenant, the whole future of the name of God in the earth, is riding on one set of shoulders. His, and those shoulders just gave out under a broom tree. No wonder he wanted to die. He believed the story of God died with him, and God lets him say all of it. No interruption, no correction mid-sentence. Heaven has a long record of letting its servants finish. And if you walked the job road with us, you know that record well. The friends talked about God and got rebuked. The sufferer yelled at God and got called my servant. Heaven can work with a true scream. It has no use for a polished lie. Elijah's answer is bitter, lopsided, and factually wrong at the end. And God receives every word of it before he responds. Then comes the instruction. Go out and stand on the mountain in the presence of the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by. The same words Moses heard. And what happens next is one of the most famous sequences in the Bible, and one of the most misread. So watch it closely. A great and powerful wind tore the mountain apart and shattered the rocks. Wind strong enough to break stone. But the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind, an earthquake, the ancient mountain itself rolling under the prophet's feet. But the Lord was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake, a fire. Stop on the fire. Fire is Elijah's native language. Fire is Carmel. Fire is his resume. Fire is the very shape. God's answer took the last time Elijah asked him to show up. If there was one form the prophet was scanning that mountain for, one signature he would have bet his life on. It was fire. And the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, the text says, came a sound Here, your English Bible has to make a choice, because the Hebrew at this point is 3 words wide and nearly untranslatable. Kol, Demama, Daka. The old King James called it a still small voice, and generations memorized it that way. The New International Version says a gentle whisper, but lean in close to the Hebrew and it is stranger than either one. Kol is a sound or a voice. Demama is silence, stillness. Daka is thin, fine, crushed almost to powder, the sound of a thin silence. A voice made of quiet. Some translators give up trying to smooth it and render it a sound of sheer silence. And honestly, that contradiction is the point. Whatever came after the fire was one shade above nothing at all, so faint that only a man holding perfectly still would ever catch it. And when Elijah heard it, he pulled his cloak over his face and went out and stood at the mouth of the cave. Mark that cloak. The wind did not move him. The earthquake did not move him. The fire, his own element, did not move him. The silence did. The prophet covered his face the way Moses covered his, because he knew, pastoral argument, that this quiet was the presence. Now be careful here, because this scene gets preached one notch too far, and the extra notch ruins it. This is not the Bible announcing that God is never in the wind or the fire. He had answered by fire on Carmel about 6 weeks earlier, and he owed nobody an apology for it. The point of this pageant is aimed at one exhausted man's assumption. Elijah had learned to recognize God at Carmel volume. Big stages, big showdowns, big results. That was where he knew how to find him. And by that measure, the last 6 weeks read as total abandonment, because the sky had gone quiet. So God ran the whole highlight reel past the cave. Wind, quake, fire, everything spectacular, and attached his presence to none of it. And then came to his prophet in a register the man had never once thought to listen for. God's presence was never confined to spectacle. A believer who can only find him in the fireworks will starve in every quiet season of his life. And most of life is quiet seasons. At Horeb, God retrained his prophet's ear, and then, out of the thin silence, the question comes again. And here is the moment this whole chapter has been walking toward. What are you doing here? Eliach. Same question, word for word. And Elijah answers, I have been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty. The Israelites have rejected your covenant, torn down your altars, and put your prophets to death with the sword. I am the only one left, and now they are trying to kill me too. Read that again slowly, and let it be as strange as it actually is. It is the same answer, word for word, clause for clause. The identical speech he gave before the wind, and the quake, and the fire, and the silence. The man just stood in the nearest thing to the raw presence of God a human being can survive. And his answer did not change by one syllable. The pain came out the far side of the encounter intact. Whatever you were taught about mountaintop experiences, here is Scripture's honest testimony. A real meeting with the living God did not instantly rewrite this man's heart. And the ache he carried up the mountain, he was still carrying at the mouth of the cave. And now watch God, because this is the verdict moment of the whole story. He does not scold the unchanged answer. There is no sigh from the silence. No, were you not listening? Eliach. No, I just did all that, and you are still stuck on Jezebel. God takes the repeated speech, receives it whole, and then does the two things the speech revealed the man actually needed. He corrects Elijah's arithmetic, and he ends Elijah's aloneness. Go back the way you came, the Lord says, and he hands Elijah work. 3 anointings, 2 kings and a successor, a future with his name still in it, which is its own quiet message to a man who just resigned. And then God saves the real payload for last. Yet I reserve 7,000 in Israel, all whose knees have not bowed down to Baal, and all whose mouths have not kissed him. 7,000. Elijah said, I am the only one left. And God said, your count is off by 7,000. Underline what just happened there, because it is the most practical sentence in this entire story for anyone running on empty. God never disputes Elijah's pain. The zeal was real. The losses were real. The danger was real. And heaven signs off on all of it without argument. What God corrects is the math. The only one left was never true. Not on the worst day. Not under the tree. Not in the cave. There were 7,000 knees that had never bowed. An entire hidden remnant, preserved by God, invisible from where Elijah was standing. And exhaustion had converted invisible into non-existent without telling him, because that is what exhaustion does. And you need to know its signature move. Exhaustion tells the truth about your pain and lies to you about your math. It is a faithful witness to how much you hurt and a terrible accountant of who else is out there. It whispers that nobody else cares. Nobody else prays. Nobody else stayed. That the whole thing rests on you. And it sounds exactly like clear-eyed realism at 1 in the morning. The engineer in Seattle is not lying about his loneliness. His floor really is empty at lunch. But somewhere in that same city, there are knees that have never bowed. More of them than he would believe. And his tiredness has been doing his census for him. And tiredness always rounds down to 1. So here is this chapter's question. What is the math your exhaustion has been doing for you? The I am the only one. The nobody else is really committed. The it all falls apart without me. You have been trusting those numbers for years. And they were tallied by the most exhausted accountant you know. When is the last time you let God audit them? But God is not finished at that cave, because among the assignments he gives Elijah on that mountain, one of them is not a task at all. It is a name, a young man, at this moment walking behind a plow in a muddy field, who has no idea he is the answer to a prayer Elijah never thought to pray. The man who left his servant in Beersheba is about to find out what God does with an empty passenger seat. It is a Wednesday morning in Charlotte, North Carolina, and the founder of a non-profit is sitting in a doctor's office, getting news he already knew. 12 years ago he started the organization at his own kitchen table, and it grew, and it fed a lot of people, and it cost him what these things cost. In 12 years he has never once taken a full week off. Not on his honeymoon. He checked email from the beach. Not when his father died. He took calls in the funeral home parking lot. His wife has asked. His board has asked. His own body has been asking for 2 years. In a language of chest tightness and 4 in the morning ceilings. And now the doctor is looking at a chart and saying the quiet part with a medical license behind it. Something has to change, or something is going to break. And the founder says the sentence he has never said out loud before, the one that has been running his whole life from the basement. You do not understand. If I stop, it collapses. It is all held up by me. The doctor looks at him for a moment. Then he asks a question that is not on any chart. And who told you that? God asked Elijah a version of that question at Horeb. And then he answered it with a young man walking behind 12 pairs of oxen. Because look at the assignments. God hands Elijah at the mouth of that cave. Go back the way you came. Anoint one king over Aram. Anoint another over Israel. Kings. Politics. The machinery of history. But the third assignment is different. And it is the one aimed straight at the broom tree. Anoint Elisha, son of Shaphat from Abel Meholah, to succeed you as prophet. Read that assignment again, and hear what is hiding inside it. God is not just giving Elijah a task. He is giving Elijah a person. The man who said, "Take my life," is being handed a future. The man who said, "I am the only one left," is being handed company. Heaven's answer to the prophet's isolation was not a pep talk and not a promotion. It was a name and an address. So Elijah comes down off the mountain of God, walks the long road north, and finds a farm. And the text gives us our first sight of the most important companion of Elijah's life. And it could not be less dramatic. Elisha, son of Shaphat, was plowing with 12 yoke of oxen, and he himself was driving the 12th pair. Stand in that field for a second. The answer to the great prophet's despair, the future of the prophetic word in Israel, the man who will one day inherit a double portion of Elijah's spirit, is currently walking behind the back end of 2 oxen with mud on his feet. 12 yoke means a serious family farm, which means this is a young man with prospects. Land, a father in the picture, a whole comfortable life mapped out in those long straight furrows. God did not pull Elijah's successor out of a seminary or a palace. He pulled him off a tractor. And there is something in that for every exhausted leader who thinks the help has to look like help before it counts. The person God has stationed in your story is probably not glowing. He is probably plowing, and Elijah went up to him and threw his cloak around him. There is the mantle. You have seen this cloak twice already on this road. So bring both sightings with you. This is the cloak Elijah tucked into his belt to outrun a chariot on the strongest day of his body. This is the cloak Elijah pulled over his face at the mouth of the cave. When the thin silence passed by, and he could not look, the same garment that covered one man's face before the presence of God now lands on a second man's shoulders in the middle of a muddy field. No sermon, no ceremony, no explanation. Elijah does not even stop walking. He throws the cloak over the boy and keeps going, as if to say, "You know what this is, and you know what it asks." And Elisha knew. He left his oxen standing in the furrow and ran after Elijah. "Let me kiss my father and mother goodbye," he said, "and then I will come with you." And then this farm boy did something that tells you everything about what kind of man just got drafted. He went back, took his yoke of oxen, and slaughtered them. He burned the plowing equipment to cook the meat, and gave it to the people, and they ate. Then he set out to follow Elijah. He barbecued his career. The oxen were the business. The plow was the future. And Elisha turned the whole thing into a farewell dinner for his village and walked away from the smoke. Now hold that bonfire up next to something you saw 4 chapters ago. On Carmel, Elijah poured 12 jars of priceless water over his own altar, drowning his escape route in front of the nation. In this field, Elisha burns his plow. 2 men, 2 generations, one identical move. Neither one of them left himself a road back. That is apparently what this calling costs in every generation. And it is worth noticing that the old burned-out prophet and the fresh young farmer paid the same price at the door. And then comes the last line of 1 Kings chapter 19. And it is easy to read right past it. So do not. Then he set out to follow Elijah and became his servant. His servant. Now run the tape back 6 weeks. There was a servant in this story once. Elijah left him at Beersheba, dropped his last human connection at the town gate, and walked into the desert to die alone, because exhaustion had convinced him that solitude was the only room left with air in it. And God let him make that walk, and met him under the tree, and fed him, and heard him out at Horeb. And then God quietly refilled the position. The man who fired his own support system got issued a better one. Not a hired hand this time. A successor, a student, a spiritual son, a companion who would spend years learning the work at his side. Elijah walked into the wilderness with an empty passenger seat. And God's final answer to everything that happened under that broom tree was to put somebody in it, and this somebody would not leave. Follow the 2 of them to the far end of the story. Years down the road, in 2 Kings chapter 2, on Elijah's last day on earth, 3 times on that final walk, Elijah turns to Elisha and says, "Stay here. The Lord has sent me on to Bethel. Stay here. The Lord has sent me on to Jericho. Stay here. The Lord has sent me to the Jordan." Maybe he was testing him. Maybe some old reflex from Beersheba was making one last attempt to walk alone. It does not matter, because 3 times Elisha gives the same answer. And it is one of the great loyalty oaths in all of Scripture. As surely as the Lord lives, and as you live, I will not leave you. I will not leave you. Say that sentence next to the broom tree, and feel the distance this man has traveled. The prophet who once engineered his own abandonment ends his road with a companion who refuses 3 times, out loud, on oath, to be left. And when the chariot of fire came, and the whirlwind took Elijah up, Elisha was standing right there watching, crying out, my father, and the cloak, the mantle, came loose in the wind and fell to the ground, and Elisha picked it up and carried it back to the Jordan, and the work went on. The mantle outlived the man, because the mantle was never about the man. And one more thing, and sit with it until it stops being irony and starts being gospel. Elijah is one of only 2 people in the entire Bible who never died. The man whose one recorded request under the broom tree was, "Take my life," is one of 2 human beings in all of Scripture who never tasted death at all. God ignored the resignation letter, and then he rewrote the retirement plan. Fire fell for this man once on a mountaintop. In the end, fire came for him a second time, not as judgment and not as spectacle, but as a ride home. So here is the counterfeit. This final turning point drags into the light, and it is the most respectable lie on the whole road, because it wears the costume of devotion. It is the belief that says, I am irreplaceable. It all depends on me. If I rest, it's this. It sounds like commitment. It preaches like faithfulness. and it is a cage. And the proof is what it does to the people who believe it, because they end up under broom trees, and in doctors' offices in Charlotte, and on kitchen floors in Nashville. Look at what God actually did with the one man in history who had the best case for being irreplaceable. God did not heal Elijah by convincing him he could carry more. He healed him by making him not alone, and by showing him that the story never depended on his strength in the first place. 7,000 knees Elijah never counted. A successor Elijah never recruited. A future Elijah never planned. The work of God in Israel was never resting on one man's shoulders. It only felt that way from inside the exhaustion. And the feeling was wrong. So here is the last question of the road. Before we walk the final stretch together, where is your plow line? Somewhere in your life, there may be an Elisha, a person God has already stationed, walking their furrows, waiting for a mantle you have been gripping with both hands because you believed the work would die without your grip. What would it cost you to loosen it? And what has it been costing you not to? One road remains, and it is the shortest one. It does not run through Israel, and it does not run through the 9th century before Christ. It runs through your week, and there is a tree at the end of it with your name carved somewhere on the trunk. Look back down the road once before you walk into your day. A man stepped into a throne room with one sentence and then spent years learning to be fed. By ravens at a dying brook, by a widow measuring out her last flour, by an angel with bread on the coals. He stood in an upstairs room holding a dead boy and yelled his why at the ceiling. And God answered the prayer without ever explaining the pain. He stood alone on a mountain against 850 voices and watched fire fall out of a clear sky. And it was the greatest day of his life. And it healed nothing inside him. He outran a chariot in the rain on borrowed strength. And then one sentence from one messenger knocked him all the way to the desert floor. He asked God to let him die, and God let him sleep instead, and touched him before speaking one word to him, and cooked for him, and told him the truth without a drop of shame in it. The journey is too much for you. He walked 40 days to the mountain where everything started, and God passed by in wind and earthquake and fire, and was in none of them. And then came in a silence so thin it made the prophet cover his face. He gave the same wounded answer twice, and God corrected his arithmetic instead of his heart. 7,000 knees he never counted. And then God gave him what no fire and no miracle had given him. A person, a hand for the mantle, a voice on the last road saying, I will not leave you. That is how God met one spiritually exhausted man. Slowly, bodily, gently, in stages, and without one single word of rebuke from the broom tree to the whirlwind. So the only question left is the one this whole road was built to ask you. Which one of them are you this morning? Some of you are at the brook right now, watching the water line drop on something God Himself led you into, and you have been quietly concluding that you must have heard Him wrong. Here is your sentence. Keep it in your pocket. The God who led you to the brook has already scheduled your Zarephath. A drying brook is a forwarding address, not an abandonment. Some of you just got your message from Jezreel. You survived the enormous things, the diagnosis, the divorce, the deployment, the season that should have killed you, and now some small threat, some email, some sentence has you on the floor, and you are ashamed of how little it took. You are allowed to be broken by the whisper after you survived the war. Elijah was. The ledger was already full, and the message was just the day the bill arrived. Some of you are under the tree tonight. You are not in danger of losing your faith. You are just done. Done in the body. Done in the soul. And you have been bracing for God's disappointment for so long, you can recite the speech. So trade speeches. God did not confuse Elijah's exhaustion with rebellion, and He is not confusing yours. Sleep is not surrender. Eat something. The theology can wait. He's waited 40 days, and if the tree is that dark tonight, do not sit under it alone. Let a friend, a pastor, a counselor come sit in the sand next to you. That is not weak faith. That is Zarephath. Provision wearing a human face. And taking the bread they bring you is obedience. Some of you have been doing the math. The only one left at the office, in the family, in the marriage, on the elder board, the last one who still believes, the last one who still tries. Your pain is telling the truth. Your math is off by 7,000, and some of you are gripping a mantle with both hands, certain that everything collapses the moment you loosen your fingers. The mantle fits other shoulders. It always did. The story was never resting on your strength, and finding that out is not a demotion. Ask Ilya. It is the beginning of being able to breathe. Maybe you found yourself at more than one marker on this road. Most honest people do. Take every sentence you need. Now, one more thing about that breakfast in the desert. Because I told you to file away the smell of it, the charcoal and the fresh bread, and it is time to take it back out. About 900 years after Elijah, on a beach at dawn, another servant of God came dragging himself ashore after the worst collapse of his life. His name was Peter, and days earlier he had denied even knowing his Lord. 3 times, warming his hands over a charcoal fire while he did it. And when Peter hauled his net onto that beach, there on the sand was a charcoal fire and bread, and the reason, Son of God, cooking. He did not open with the denial. He did not open with a lecture. He said, "Come and have breakfast." Same signature, same cook. The God who fed one exhausted prophet under a broom tree had not changed. His first response to broken servants in 900 years. And He has not changed it in 2,000 more. Touch, bread, time, and only then, gently, the questions. And even the questions were not accusations. They were an invitation to keep going. Together, and Elijah. One more mountain. Centuries after the whirlwind. On a high ridge in Galilee, Jesus of Nazareth stood transfigured in glory, His face shining like the sun. And 2 men stood there talking with Him, Moses and Elijah. The man who once begged God for death under a desert shrub stood in the unfiltered light of God on the brightest mountaintop in the New Testament. Alive, at home, in on the conversation. God took His prophet's worst chapter and made him a witness to history's best one. That is what He does with exhausted people who let Him finish the story. Before you pick up your day, let me pray a short one over you, and I will keep it plain, because you have had enough performances for one lifetime. Father, someone listening is under the tree tonight. Do for them what you did for your prophet. Before you say one word, come close. Guard their sleep. Put bread within reach, and put a hand on their shoulder. yours, and then somebody's with skin on it. Tell them the truth gently, that the journey is too much, and that this was never news to you. Fix their math, and when they are ready, not one day sooner, show them the road back, and someone to walk it with. Amen. Elijah believed everything depended on him. God spent 3 chapters of the Bible showing him it never had. The God who met Elijah beneath the broom tree still knows how to find the exhausted. He is not waiting for you to climb back up the mountain. He knows the way to the tree.